The sirens inside the deep space mining station Aegis 7 didn't wail. They groaned, a low, mechanical death rattle that vibrated through the reinforced bulkheads and sent a cold shiver through the metal flooring. Elite Commander Vaelen of the Valari Dominion stepped through the melted, jagged remains of the primary airlock, his heavy plasma rifle raised and humming with lethal energy. Behind him, 3 full squads of shock troops poured into the dark corridor, their heavy armor clicking against the deck plates. To the Valari, this was supposed to be a routine asset reclamation, a simple display of power against a minor species. The humans, or Deathworlders, as the stellar charts cautiously labeled them, were considered a low-tier, fragile species by the Dominion, living on the fringes of civilized space. Vaelen looked down the quiet, shadowed corridor and sneered under his armored helmet, confident that the sector was already theirs. They had taken the perimeter without firing a single shot, and the lack of initial resistance only solidified his belief that the humans would surrender the moment they faced true galactic military might. He signaled his tech officers to secure the entry point, completely unaware that the silence of the station was not a sign of defeat, but the quiet drawing in of a breath before an impending storm. The dark hallways seemed entirely abandoned, devoid of any visible defensive structures or personnel trap installations, further encouraging their rapid advance. Every step deeper into the facility felt like claiming empty territory for the Empire, inflating the egos of the shock troops who expected a desperate struggle. Vaelen mapped out the layout on his tactical display, noting that the primary infrastructure remained fully operational and ripe for extraction. The squad spread out into standard sweep formations, clear tactical fluid movements designed to lock down heavy machinery nodes before the inhabitants could trigger sabotage sequences. The air grew stagnant, smelling faintly of ozone and old machine grease, common for deep space installations left to run on automated life cycles. Vaelen communicated with his vanguard units, reinforcing the order to capture the central command module before any emergency distress beacons could leak planetary tracking data to nearby human sectors. He trusted their superior technology to handle whatever primitive obstacles the mining crew might have left behind as a last resort. With their weapons charged and shields flickering at baseline readiness, the Valari forces pushed forward into the dark mechanical heart of Sector 7. Vaelen tapped his wrist console, connecting directly to the command deck of the dreadnought hovering just outside the station's massive superstructure. Bridge, execute Phase 2. Cut the station's localized gravity matrix and kill the primary power grids immediately, he ordered, his voice dripping with absolute confidence. In galactic warfare, disabling gravity was the ultimate tactical shutdown, a flawless maneuver designed to break an enemy's spirit before a physical engagement even began. 99% of known species completely lost their spatial orientation when unanchored, suffering from severe nausea, panic, and a total inability to aim weapons or coordinate movements in 0G. As the artificial hum of the deck plates died and the overhead lights flickered out into pitch darkness, Vaelen's squad activated their high-end magnetic boots with a synchronized, heavy clack. They stood firmly locked to the floor, heavy, stable, and completely in control of their environment. The humans, they assumed, were now floating helplessly in the dark corridors like fish in a drained pond, utterly paralyzed by the sudden loss of their physical footing. The calculated transition from standard environment to dead space went perfectly according to Valari military doctrine, leaving no room for operational errors. Vaelen checked his squad status monitors, confirming that every single soldier maintained perfect magnetic alignment with the metal deck plating beneath their feet. The complete absence of gravitational pull caused dust particles and small industrial tools to rise silently from the surfaces, drifting aimlessly through the pitch-black air like tiny, stagnant satellites. This stark visual environment served as a reminder of the absolute tactical superiority the Dominion held over lesser-developed civilizations across the Outer Rim. Vaelen adjusted the polarization settings on his helmet visor to compensate for the sudden loss of auxiliary illumination, switching over to narrow-band infrared imaging systems. He gave the advance order, confident that their target was completely neutralized, mentally preparing to document the swift capture of the asset for high command records. The silence that followed the power cut was absolute, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the Valari soldiers through their internal respirators. Vaelen led his team deeper into the maintenance sectors, checking his glowing heads-up display to map out the route to the station's primary core. Suddenly, a localized, low-frequency radio band crackled to life over the station's emergency frequencies, cutting through the static with jarring clarity. It wasn't a frantic plea for mercy, a terrified scream, or a disorganized surrender offer from a broken command structure. It was a calm, steady human voice transmitting from the central command nest, completely unfazed by the sudden darkness. Gravity matrix offline. All sectors report baseline 0G. Initiating standard defensive protocol. Stage 3. Vaelen frowned beneath his visor, a sudden prickle of unease touching the back of his neck. The human didn't sound panicked, nor did he sound like a soldier facing total annihilation. He sounded entirely routine, like a seasoned supervisor checking off mundane items on a daily safety checklist. This bizarre display of absolute composure raised immediate red flags in Vaelen's operational analysis, challenging his basic assumptions about human behavior under sudden tactical duress. He raised a hand to halt the main column, gesturing for his scanning specialists to isolate the source location of the transmission line. The data stream was clean, lacking the standard audio distortion commonly associated with emergency transmissions handled by terrified structural survivors during an active military raid. The silence returned just as quickly as it had been broken, leaving only the dull hum of their armor's internal life support loops to fill the void. Vaelen updated the primary threat assessment matrix on his command console, marking the human defense force as highly organized despite their lack of advanced heavy weaponry. He ordered all squads to switch to dense defensive arrays, ensuring that every angle of the corridor was covered by at least 2 active targeting reticles. Form a defensive perimeter, Vaelen commanded over the squad channel, a sudden, inexplicable knot tightening in his chest as he gripped his rifle tighter. Watch the intersections, and keep your shields overlapping. The shock troops raised their energy barriers, their heavy magnetic boots keeping them rooted to the deck plates as they scanned the pitch-black hallway with narrow tactical lights. Suddenly, the advanced motion trackers on their HUDs began to glitch, flickering wildly with erratic data strings. Green blips flashed briefly at the edges of the radar screens, only to vanish into static a fraction of a second later. They weren't approaching from the front corridors, nor were they creeping up from the rear blind spots where the squad expected an ambush. According to the sensors, multiple targets were moving at impossible speeds directly above them, navigating along the structural support beams, exposed conduits, and ventilation housing near the ceiling. The technological disturbance grew more severe as they entered the primary manufacturing nexus, threatening to cut off internal squad telemetry systems entirely. Vaelen tapped the side of his helmet, attempting to manually calibrate the short-range target acquisition scanners to filter out the structural interference. The phantom signatures continued to dance across the interface, moving with an aggressive velocity that defied standard biological locomotive limits recorded for bipedal organisms. The Valari soldiers shifted their stances nervously, their heavy boots shifting slightly on the deck plates as they kept their primary weapon optics fixed on the high ceiling framework. The shadows above seemed to warp and shift in response to the sweeping tactical lights, creating a highly disorienting landscape within the narrow confines of the structural corridor. Vaelen commanded absolute fire discipline, knowing that a single premature discharge could compromise their entire defensive position. "Hold your positions. Do not break formation," yelled squad leader Krell, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp arc through the floating dust particles and frozen condensation. A sharp, metallic ping echoed from the heavy ceiling pipes 20 feet above them, a sound that seemed to dance away into the shadows. Krell raised his rifle to aim upward into the gloom, but before his weapon could clear the horizon, a sudden, violent rush of displaced air swept past the formation. There was no flash of plasma fire, no roar of an engine, and no battle cry to give away an attacker's position. Just a sickeningly heavy, metallic thud that vibrated through the structure. When Vaelen swung his tactical light toward Krell's designated position, the squad leader was completely gone. His heavy magnetic boots were still locked firmly to the floor plates, entirely empty, with the emergency release clips cleanly and violently sheared off from the ankles. The absolute speed of the abduction left the remaining soldiers frozen in complete disbelief, their automated targeting systems failing to register a single solid biological profile. Vaelen stepped forward, inspecting the empty equipment boots with his tactical scanner to determine the direction of the kinetic displacement vector. The structural brackets holding the magnetic coils had been twisted apart by immense physical power, indicating an attack style that relied entirely on raw mechanical leverage rather than advanced energy weaponry. The dark ceiling space remained completely silent, offering no visual clues as to where the squad leader had been dragged through the open layout. A heavy sense of vulnerability descended upon the remaining troopers as they realized their heavy armor offered zero protection against this unseen structural threat. Vaelen ordered an immediate tactical withdrawal toward the main hangar bay, hoping to establish a wider field of view. Panic began to ripple through the elite Valari ranks like a contagion, shattering their rigid military discipline. They fired blind, frantic plasma bursts into the upper shadows, illuminating the massive ceiling architecture in brief, violent flashes of stark blue light. The brilliant illumination revealed nothing but empty pipes, dangling wires, and cold steel beams, yet every time the darkness reclaimed the corridor, another soldier disappeared into the void. One trooper was yanked violently sideways into an open maintenance shaft with a sudden screech of metal. Another was pulled straight up into the gloom without even a chance to cry out over the comms. The attackers were completely silent, operating without thrusters or mechanical assistance, moving through the zero-gravity environment with an aggressive agility that defied every known law of galactic combat tactics. The sheer efficiency of the ambush turned the tight corridor into a slaughterhouse, completely neutralizing the Valari advantage in heavy armor and firepower layout. Every frantic shot fired by the remaining soldiers simply bounced off the heavy structural supports, leaving molten scars on the metal without striking a single human target. Vaelen checked his squad status monitors, watching the vital readouts drop one after another into dead system states. The rapid breakdown of command structure forced the survivors into a desperate run for survival, their boots clacking violently against the flooring as they manually overrode the safety protocols on their suits. The darkness seemed to actively press down upon them, swallowing the fading light of their energy weapons with terrifying ease. They could hear the faint sound of shifting metal ahead, indicating that the human defense forces were actively shaping the engagement area to cut off any remaining paths of retreat. Vaelen pushed his remaining troops faster, desperate to reach the open geometry of the hangar bay. Driven back by the invisible, relentless terror in the corridors, Vaelen and his remaining 4 soldiers retreated into the vast, open expanse of the primary cargo hangar. It was a massive, cavernous room 300 meters wide, completely devoid of atmosphere, artificial light, and gravity, offering no easy places to hide. "Line up, back to back, don't let them separate us," Vaelen roared, his voice cracking with uncharacteristic fear over the encrypted short-range comms. The remaining invaders stuck their magnetic boots to the top of a central cargo crate, aiming their weapons outward into the vast, empty void of the hangar like cornered animals. Vaelen reached into his tactical belt with a trembling hand, pulled out a high-intensity military magnesium flare, and prepared to face the unknown. "Let us see what we are fighting," he snarled, striking the ignite switch and hurling the device directly into the frozen center of the room. The blinding chemical reaction illuminated the massive hangar layout in an instant, cutting through the heavy gloom with a harsh, unyielding white brilliance that exposed every hidden corner. The stark light revealed the true scale of the industrial complex, highlighting the dense web of structural beams that crisscrossed the upper levels. The survivors held their breath as the flare drifted slowly through the vacuum, its brilliant spark throwing long, dancing shadows across the empty loading docks below. Every eye was fixed on the shifting light patterns, searching for any sign of the stealth units that had decimated their infiltration force in the tunnels. The heavy silence of the hangar bay felt like an active presence, holding the remaining Valari soldiers in a state of absolute tension as they waited for the final clash. Vaelen raised his rifle to his shoulder, determined to sell his life dearly if the entity chose to strike them in the open light. The flare ignited with a brilliant, blinding white glare, casting harsh, long-tailed shadows across the entire expanse of the hangar bay. What Vaelen saw in the sudden, burning light made his blood run cold beneath his armor. The humans weren't using advanced stealth suits, gravity-defying jetpacks, or specialized magnetic gear to traverse the darkness. Dozens of them were scattered across the scaffolding, dangling wires, and structural beams of the ceiling, completely unanchored and floating freely in the vacuum. They weren't helpless or disoriented at all. Instead, they were moving with terrifying, fluid precision. They were using their bare hands to swing effortlessly from pipe to pipe, launching themselves across massive structural gaps with explosive leg strength, and using the complex architecture of the ceiling exactly like the ancient apex predators of their home world. The complete absence of weight constraints allowed them to execute complex, multi-axis maneuvers that would be utterly impossible for species native to low-gravity environments. They drifted through the metal framework with absolute confidence, their bodies perfectly aligned to absorb and redirect momentum with every casual touch of the infrastructure. Vaelen watched in horror as a human engineer launched himself off a primary support beam, spinning effortlessly through the open air to catch a parallel conduit 50 feet away without missing a beat. Their movements were entirely natural, lacking the mechanical stiffness of thruster-based navigation systems commonly used by galactic military personnel. The white light of the flare reflected off the clear viewports of their basic pressure suits, revealing faces that were completely calm and focused on the tactical task at hand. The entire hangar space had been transformed into a vertical hunting ground, perfectly optimized for their unique physiological advantages. As a looming shadow fell over his position, Vaelen finally understood the fatal, catastrophic mistake of the Valari Dominion's intelligence reports. They had looked at human history and seen a species bound to the heavy dirt of a high-gravity world, assuming that removing that gravity would render them weak. They had completely forgotten why Earth was classified as a high-tier Deathworld in the first place. Humans hadn't evolved in flat, smooth, sterile environments. They had evolved in complex, multidimensional terrains filled with steep mountains, jagged cliffs, and dense forest canopies. Their biological brains possessed a hyper-advanced spatial awareness called proprioception, paired with vestigial skeletal mechanics built specifically for climbing, leaping, and grasping under immense planetary strain. By disabling the station's gravity, the Valari hadn't paralyzed the humans. They had merely removed their only physical limitation. The heavy planetary leash was off, and the apex hunters of Earth were finally free to fly through the dark. The realization hit Vaelen with crushing force as he observed the unique biomechanics displayed by the attacking human units above him. Their muscular development, refined by generations of survival against intense terrestrial gravity forces, translated into terrifying kinetic potential within the zero-G environment. A single-leg drive against a solid surface could propel a human across the entire width of the hangar bay with the velocity of a small artillery shell. The complex neurological wiring required to calculate these trajectories instantly, without the aid of targeting computers, was a native evolutionary trait unique to their Deathworld heritage. The Dominion had inadvertently unlocked the full combat capability of a species designed to conquer nature at its most brutal levels. The brilliant white light of the magnesium flare sputtered and died down, leaving the massive hangar bay in a dim, ghostly gray afterglow. Vaelen's remaining men were entirely gone, their weapons drifting silently in the void alongside the debris of the brief encounter. The Valari commander slowly dropped his rifle, his heavy magnetic boots finally losing power as he drifted aimlessly away from the cargo crate and into the center of the room. A single human soldier, wearing a simple, unadorned pressure suit without any visible thrusters or mechanical gear, drifted calmly through the dark toward him. The human reached out with casual ease, caught a floating guide wire with just 2 fingers, and arrested his forward momentum instantly with perfect biological control. He looked through his clear visor at the terrified alien commander, smiled faintly in the dim light, and whispered a chilling message over the open emergency frequency. "You thought gravity was our anchor. You didn't realize it was our leash." The transmission cut out immediately after the final word, leaving Vaelen alone with his thoughts in the freezing, airless space of the station core. The human soldier gave a slight flick of his wrist, launching himself backward into the structural shadows of the ceiling framework with effortless grace. Vaelen watched him disappear into the dark architecture, knowing that the story of Aegis 7 would serve as a permanent warning to the High Command of the Dominion. The galaxy would finally learn to respect the baseline physical heritage of the species they had so casually dismissed as primitive outcasts. As his life support systems began to flag under the extreme cold, the commander closed his eyes, finally understanding the true cost of challenging the children of the Deathworld. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.